Cannabis. What's the first thing that comes to mind? Do you perceive it positively or negatively? And have you ever asked yourself why?
Hey there! Sorry for being dramatic. It's Sam here, and over this past semester, our cannabis inquiry class has engaged in so many rich discussions. And at the time of the individual project proposal, I noticed three recurring themes: stigma, scientific versus anecdotal evidence, and political influences on legalization. And so I wondered, what are some of the perspectives that exist outside of our classroom? And that's when the light bulb moment hit me. Maybe, just maybe, I can interview researchers, policy experts, and people with lived experience using cannabis. And so that's exactly the purpose of this project. So after consulting with Eric to discuss the ethics, which he said, yes, it's ethical, I drafted a list of informal interview questions as outlined here. And I reached out to all of these people, from researchers from McMaster's Cannabis Group to my local Richmond Hill MP. And luckily, three people were down to have 1 hour Zoom conversations with me. And today I'm super excited to share with you what I've learned. But first, let me first go over how I went about narrowing down 3 hours worth of footage into its most salient points.
So I used the Braun and Clark reflexive thematic analysis method to synthesize key themes. And here on the screen is the summary of the approach. First, I familiarized myself with the conversation transcripts and noted down key ideas. Next, using a qualitative content analysis software called Deduce, which, by the way, has a 1-month free trial, highly recommend, I began generating initial codes. So for example, reasons for stigma, misconceptions, social media, etc. Then, using excerpts extracted in the first 2 steps, I searched for emerging themes. Ideally, there should be more than one reviewer for thematic analysis and further refinement of the themes, but given the time constraints, this was not feasible. Here is a thematic map that I've generated from doing content analysis, and for the rest of this video, I'll be highlighting the key messages that really stood out to me.
With all that said, let me first introduce you to our guests.
Sadly, I've never used, so just so that it's on record. My research focuses on looking at stresses during pregnancy and what happens to the babies.
In 2016, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. So that's a type of blood cancer. And one of the many drugs I was taking was called nabilone.
I would say my experience with cannabis is twofold. One as a researcher, and another with someone who I'm close to who uses cannabis to medicate anxiety.
When asked if they thought cannabis is stigmatized in Canada, there was an overwhelming agreement that yes, cannabis is stigmatized.
I definitely think it's stigmatized. My mom gave me a hard time when she found out I was going in this area of research. So, when we were doing these breast milk things. And so it's clear that at least the women are so fearful of being stigmatized by cannabis use that they think their babies will be taken away by Children's Aid, right? So that there must be some rationale to that somebody at Children's Aid thinks that cannabis use results in a bad mother.
It's even within the research community, a very divided response. There are people who believe that the endocannabinoid system is obviously something undeniable. It's real, it's physiologically relevant, there's no doubting that. But whether cannabis actually works is heavily debated. And there are psychologists, there are researchers, there are doctors who do not believe that it has value.
And so, why do these stigmas exist in the first place? There were several ideas as to why.
Like from my own research in class and things like that there is some pushback from doctors in different areas, and just that perhaps generational, perhaps just people are not willing to take that risk.
But it's really hard to change individual opinions, right? It's people are quite set in their ways, especially as they get older. They believe what they believe, and it doesn't matter if the world collapses around them, they continue to believe.
I always thought that part of the reason for the stigma was the generational gap or political differences. However, after hearing Katya's take on this, it made me reflect on this stance.
I actually think that older people are very open to medicinal cannabis use. They're very curious. They've probably entered the age of having aches, pains, chronic disorders that have evolved over their lifetime. They may even remember dabbling with cannabis in their youth. And now that it's legal, many of them are very curious to see if the properties of it could be valuable in helping them cope with some of the chronic disorders. So it's really not a young versus old dichotomy in the stigma. So I think it's really the education aspect more than being liberal or not liberal. I've seen some people who are conservative but are perfectly willing to kind of start to open their mind towards the possibility that cannabis may be valuable.
Next, we discuss what are some common misconceptions about cannabis today. It seems that there are many angles to take this, from misconceptions about health effects to who we typically associate cannabis users with.
Just the name that it's synthetic cannabis. Like, yes, it is doing a purpose that THC also does, but for me, there was nothing special about it. It doesn't give you a high or anything like that. It doesn't make you happier or make things feel better. It just takes away one little symptom. So it's just like any other drug. When I was going through my treatment, I was just told it's nabalone, and that was just one of the many drugs. And I was never told it was really not medicinal, like synthetic cannabis, until like part way through, and my dad brought it up one day. He's like, "Oh, you know this? That's fun fact." And I was like, "What? Okay, cool, great." And it was just a little add-on that my doctor, even though she was very thorough and I knew so much, it was just not like a need to know thing, because, and then maybe that's a good thing.
People associate users with sort of, junkie, sort of a very negative connotation to people that use, at least for the women in pregnancy that use them. I mean, generally it is people with sort of lower socioeconomic standing. It is people perhaps with lower levels of education. However, there's a lot of people who, are doctors and lawyers who use cannabis in pregnancy.
If you use marijuana and you're just a waste and a burden to society. And I think that's a huge misconception. If I can tell a story from graduate school years ago at McGill, there was a student who I worked with, and she had really terrible ADHD. I never realized that every time I met her, she was high, and I never would have known. I never would have known, because actually being high allowed her to do her work. It sounds really counterintuitive. It sounds like this can't be true, but in her case, it allowed her to focus and it allowed her to get her work done.
From that, I also asked about whether or not social media could have played a role in these misconceptions, and here were the response.
Social media is another topic we could talk about for days, right?
For sure.
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, the problem is with people. I think this, the fake news, fake information that gets out sometimes through social media contributes to these misconceptions, and I think it is a problem.
It's very like pop in your face, grab your attention, take you away from doing whatever you're doing. But that's the point of the media.
It's very easy to prey on people who are vulnerable and who are looking desperately for something that's going to take away the suffering or their condition, their pain, their anxiety, their disorder, whatever it is. And so I think the way that media campaigns are used need to be very cautious.
So shifting gears a bit, I was also curious about this current state of medicinal cannabis in Canada. Specifically, is the scientific research at the level it should be?
I think we are sort of in the toddler phase of cannabis research where everything looks exciting and we're gonna fall on our faces and make make a mess of ourselves. Probably there's going to be a lot of misdirected research, but that's how knowledge accumulation works.
Given that there are current gaps in scientific research, I posed the question, well, is there value to anecdotal evidence?
Again, there's a stigma with anecdotal evidence of saying, well, this is just people and they're desperate and they're discussing things and maybe it's just a placebo effect. But I really always feel like there's a grain of truth when you start to scroll through and you see many, many similar positive stories or negative, it doesn't matter what it is, that there's something going on that cries for more research.
When you get anecdotal evidence from a number of people and common themes start coming out, you have to ask yourself, well, there must be something here, right? It provides at best, it provides good data. At worst, it provides direction.
So as a last topic of discussion, I was curious to know what people thought about cannabis being legalized back in 2018.
Remember, it's a huge political thing, right? I think Trudeau took a lot of hits around the legalization in terms of political capital.
Politicians do have a big say, considering like historically, like it seems that like it's just one of the many platform points in a sense where you have like gun control or you have where it's this person would be in favor or not. Okay, their government is now in power. Okay, platform points arise from the fact that it has to be acceptable enough to get you into power.
But given that the science wasn't quite there and there is this political motivation behind legalization, my question next was, were we ready to legalize cannabis back in 2018?
I always think, well, having worked in government in the US a long time ago in the Senate, I realized how quickly things get kiboshed and don't move forward and don't gain any traction. And if there isn't that push and that movement to ratify a bill and get it done and out the door, then
Not gonna happen.
it gets stuck for years. And I think, yes, there were so many details that could have been worked out, but it was kind of a monumental thing happening. It was a big movement. It led to all these other thoughts of, oh, well, how do we deal with this and how do we deal with that? If not in 2018, then when?
From what I remember from like my own experience and from those around me, I just remember it becoming legal, it being a thing. But I was never educated on like what is within the Cannabis Act or what is not being considered. And there's a lot within it. There's a lot of regulations and restrictions that I would never have frankly known.
Health Canada has a lot of restrictions to researchers getting cannabis. So I think that's one of the things that really needs to be addressed. In theory, I could have gone, it would be easier for me to take my rats and mice to my garage and buy cannabis and do the research in my garage rather than bring cannabis into the university.
I hope you found those perspectives as insightful as I did. Before we end off the video, here is the final thoughts from our guests.
I'm going to put in a plug for learning more about cannabis and pregnancy because I think that's one of the things we've been learning in our own research is the the placenta is such a hugely metabolic organ, how it processes and then interprets. It's got this dual role, and so I think it's really interesting how it might deal with cannabis and the damage or the signaling and the transmission of cannabis to the fetus. We know a few things. We certainly need to know more. So that's one thing that I'm a big advocate of. And the other thing I think I told you was I really do think we need to get kids' voices into this, because they're going to be the cannabis consumers and or not of the future. And I think bringing them into the conversation early in their development is really important.
My opinion has been vastly changed. I grew up with my mother being very anti-marijuana, and I think through my research, I've really started to switch my perspectives a lot. And, you know, meeting with scientists who have done some of this research through, you know, 40 years, 50 years of research in the field, like Dr. Meshulam, and the power of the endocannabinoid system. You know, our body is wired to respond to our endogenous cannabinoids. So, yes, and these extracts can be medicinally powerful because we already have it naturally in our systems, and it's controlling a lot of our homeostasis, and so much research is going to be really unraveling the connections. And I think I've gone through a conversion in seeing it firsthand actually working, you know.
A sheer amount of information that comes from the like cancer side of things, from the cancer treatment domain, is like piles and piles of paper. So what would be necessary for them to know with regards to cannabis? Because we've been looking at perhaps research and like, yes, obviously they should know about this, but realistically in a clinical setting, would it be something, what should we consider to be enough? The more we normalize it as a drug and the more we critically analyze and put into play all the research and the clinical experience, that I hope it'll become more robust and more acceptable.
Thank you so much, Anjali, Katya, and Sandy, for sharing your perspectives. Having these conversations was lots of fun and also helpful for myself and perhaps our class to consider different ideas and build a nuanced stance on issues surrounding cannabis. With that said, that's the end of this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and this is not a YouTube video, so I will not be seeing you next time. Alright, take care. Bye.